Bruchim Aboyim again, welcome to our home, and thank you for attending the lecture this week. So this week on my thoughts, we'll continue with our in-depth examination of Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers, with the 6th Mishnah in the 2nd chapter, with the teaching of Hillel HaZaken, Hillel the Elder. Now the Mishnah tells us that Hillel the Elder once saw a skull that was floating on the water, and he said to it, "Because you drowned others, they drowned you, and in the end, those who drown you will themselves be drowned." Now, at first glance, this mission appears harsh and somewhat mysterious. Why is Hillel the Elder speaking to a skull? What message is hidden in these strange words? And why does the Mishnah choose a floating skull rather than a complete body or any other image entirely? But beneath these lines lies one of the deepest teachings in Pirkei Avot, connecting divine providence, justice, human responsibility, ego, violence, and the ripple effect of every action that a human being performs in this world. It's interesting to note that Hillel expresses his thoughts in Aramaic and not Hebrew. His intent was that it should be understood by the masses. He felt that it was imperative that they know that if the earthly court does not punish an evil person for their transgressions, we can be certain that there is a God in heaven who will exact payment from the sinner. No evil action goes unpunished. Now the commentaries explain that this Mishnah is not merely speaking about murder. It is speaking about the spiritual law of existence itself. Nothing disappears. No deed vanishes into thin air. Every word, every action, every kindness, every cruelty creates waves that continue traveling long after the moment itself has passed. A person often believes that he can act without consequence. He imagines that if nobody sees him, then nothing remains. But Judaism teaches us that the universe remembers, the soul remembers, heaven remembers. And perhaps deepest of all, the human being himself remembers, even when he tries to forget. The skull floating on the water is symbolic. The Maharal of Prague explains that a skull represents the human intellect stripped of its illusion. During a lifetime, a person walks proudly, imagining himself permanent and powerful. But in death, all masks disappear. The skull is what remains after honor, wealth, status, and appearance are removed. It is the final equalizer. And why floating on water? Because water in Torah often symbolizes movement, consequence, and the flow of history. Sin does not stand still. Goodness does not stand still. Everything in life moves forward. A person throws one stone in the river of life and thinks that splash is over, but the circles continue, widening far beyond what the eye can see. Rabbeinu Yonah explains that the Mishnah is teaching the principle of what we call midah keneged midah, measure for measure. The way a person behaves towards others becomes the way that heaven will eventually behave towards him. Not as revenge, but as revelation. God allows a person to experience the world he himself has created. If a person creates kindness, eventually kindness will surround him. If a person creates cruelty, eventually cruelty returns to him. A person lives inside the spiritual atmosphere that he himself builds with his own hands. The holy Baal Shem Tov taught an extraordinary idea. He explained that when a person witnesses something negative in another human being, heaven may be showing him a reflection of something that exists within himself. The world then becomes somewhat of a mirror for the soul. Perhaps this is why Hillel the Elder speaks to the skull. He's not speaking only to the dead man. He is speaking to every living person who sees it. He is speaking to all of us. Look carefully. He says, do not imagine that actions disappear. The Kotzker Rebbe once said that people are very careful about what they put into their stomachs, but not so careful enough about what they put into their heart. Hatred, jealousy, arrogance, humiliation, these poisons eventually destroy not only others, but the person himself. Sometimes the drowning mentioned in the Mishnah is literal, sometimes it's emotional, sometimes spiritual. There are people who drown others in shame, people who drown others in criticism, people who drown others in anger, people who drown others by just withholding love. A sharp tongue can drown a soul more deeply than water ever could. And yet the Mishnah is not merely threatening punishment, it is revealing the structure of creation. God built this world in such a way that spiritual energy circles back to its source. The Zohar explains that every deed a person performs creates an angel. Acts of kindness, create defending angels. Acts of cruelty create accusing angels. A person walks through life surrounded by the spiritual children that are a creation of his own behavior. This is frightening, but also unbelievably hopeful. Because if negativity returns, then guess what? So does goodness. Every smile returns. Every act of patience returns. Every hidden kindness returns. Every moment of self-restraint returns. A person may think that his small acts are insignificant, but heaven counts differently than do human beings. The Rambam writes that a person should always view the world as perfectly balanced between merit and guilt. One deed can tip the scale not just for the individual, but in addition for the entire world. That being the case, one word, one act, one moment is important because everything matters. The Hasidic masters explained that the skull specifically represents a person who lived only in his own intellect and ego. The head became disconnected from the heart. He knew many things, but he did not feel other people's pain. There are people who are brilliant but cold, religious but insensitive, learned but arrogant. This Mishnah warns us that intellect without humility becomes dangerous. Torah that does not soften the heart can become a form of ego. And that is why the greatest sages were the humblest of people. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, was the greatest prophet who ever lived, specifically because he was Ish Anav Ma'od, the humblest of all men. The Holy Baal Shem Tov taught that the purpose of spiritual growth is not merely to become holier, but to become gentler. A person can fast all day and still wound another human being with one sentence. The skull floating on the water is therefore not only about death, it's about emptiness. A life disconnected from compassion eventually becomes hollow. And then comes the final line of the Mishnah, and those who drowned you will themselves be drowned. The cycle continues. Violence breeds violence. Hatred breeds hatred. Ego breeds ego. Pain spreads unless someone possesses the courage to stop that chain. This may be one of the great deepest messages in the entire Mishnah. Someone must choose not to continue the cycle. Someone must absorb pain without returning it. Someone must answer hatred with dignity. Someone must answer insults with restraint, and that person changes history. The Chafetz Chaim once explained that when a person restrains himself from responding angrily, entire decrees in heaven can be nullified. Silence can be more powerful than retaliation. Perhaps this is why the Jewish people survived history again and again. They transformed suffering into compassion, exile into faith, pain into prayer. The water of history tried to drown us, yet Torah taught us how to float above them. The Arizal explains that souls can return to this world to repair what they've damaged previously in other lives. Every difficult relationship may contain ancient unfinished work. Every challenge may be an opportunity for tikkun, for spiritual repair. This Mishnah therefore becomes deeply personal. What cycles am I continuing? What pain am I passing forward? What atmosphere enters a room when I walk into it? Do people feel safer near me, or do they feel smaller? Do my words heal, or do they drown? A human being rarely remembers all the speeches he heard in life, but he remembers forever how someone made him feel. One sentence can save a life. One humiliation can wound a soul for decades. The Mishnah is asking us to recognize the terrifying power that words possess. The Lubavitcher Rebbe emphasized repeatedly that every Jew is an olam mole, an entire world. To hurt one person is to wound a universe. To uplift one person is to illuminate a universe. And perhaps this explains why Hillel the Elder speaks specifically when he sees a skull floating alone. A skull has no identity left, no wealth, no title, no social standing. In the end, only one question still remains. How did you treat God's children? Not how famous you were, not how wealthy you were, not how intelligent you were, but whether another human being felt more alive after meeting you. The waters eventually carry away everything external. Only the soul remains. There's a beautiful teaching from the disciples of the Holy Baal Shem Tov. They explain that water also represents Torah. When a person enters Torah with humility, then Torah elevates him like an ark floating safely upon the water. But when a person enters Torah with ego, seeking honor and superiority, the very waters that could have lifted him begin to drown him instead. Torah is compared to water because water gives life, but water can also overwhelm. Everything depends on whether a person bends with humility or hardens with pride. The skull floating on the water may therefore represent someone who possessed wisdom but lacked refinement of character. And this is why Pirkei Avot focuses so heavily not merely on knowledge, but on midot, character traits. A holy person is not merely someone who knows sacred books. A holy person is someone who makes other people feel seen, heard, and valued. Bottom line, imagine standing beside the Jordan River watching that skull drift silently upon the current. The river moves endlessly forward. History moves endlessly forward. Human lives appear and disappear like waves upon the surface. And yet, every action echoes forever. A person may think, it was only one word. It was only one moment. It was only one act. But heaven measures differently. The Mishnah is teaching us that we are all throwing stones into the waters of eternity. The only question is, what kind of waves are we creating? I'd like to conclude my thought, with a powerful story told about Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan, known as the Chafetz Chaim, that captures the essence of this Mishnah perhaps better than any commentary. There was a young man who once traveled a great distance to visit the Chafetz Chaim. He was known in his town as intelligent, sharp, and successful. He learned well, prayed well, and after outwardly appeared respectable, but beneath the surface, he possessed a cutting tongue. He mocked people quietly, embarrassed others subtly, and justified it all by saying, I only speak the truth. Truth, after all, can become a weapon when it lacks compassion. So this young man arrived in the small town village of Radin during a freezing winter evening. Snow covered the roads and the icy wind pierced through his coat. Exhausted from the travel, he entered the humble home of the Chafetz Chaim, expecting warmth, grandeur, and perhaps a gathering of distinguished scholars. But instead, he found simplicity. A wooden table, old benches, books worn from years of use. And there was an elderly sage whose face radiated gentleness. Well, the Chofetz Chaim welcomed him warmly and invited him to sit near the fire. After some conversation, the young man began to speak proudly about the people in his community. This rabbi lacks wisdom. That businessman is dishonest. That man pretends to be righteous. This one is ignorant. Now, the Chofetz Chaim listened quietly. Not once did he interrupt. Not once did he rebuke the young man. But then, after several minutes, the Chofetz Chaim stood up slowly, put on his coat, and said to this man, "Come with me." Well, the young man was a bit confused, but he followed. They walked through the dark, snowy streets in silence until they reached the edge of town where there was a frozen river. The moonlight reflected faintly upon the ice, and the wind howled across the empty landscape. The Chofetz Chaim stopped walking. He pointed towards a small, dark object that was beneath the frozen water near the riverbank. He said to the young man, "What do you see?" Well, the young man squinted. He said, "Looks like perhaps a branch or some garbage trapped in the ice." The Chofetz Chaim nodded softly. Then he said words that the young man would never forget. He said, "Many years ago, a wagon driver drowned here during a storm. People said he was cruel with his horses, cruel with his family, cruel with anyone that was weaker than himself. He shouted constantly, humiliating constantly. Everyone feared him." Now, the young man was listening carefully. The villagers said that when they pulled his body from the river, somehow his face looked terrified. The Chofetz Chaim asked him, "Do you know what frightened him the most?" The young man shook his head. He finally saw the waves that he had created. The Chofetz Chaim continued, "A person believes words disappear after they are spoken. They do not. Every word enters a heart. Some words heal. Some words freeze inside another your being for 30 years. Then the Chofetz Chaim bent down slowly, picked up a small stone, and he threw it across the frozen river. The stone slid across the ice, making long scratching sounds in the silence. He asked, "Do you hear that? That is how words travel through the world. Long after the hand releases them, they continue moving." The Chofetz Chaim now turned toward him directly, but there was no anger in his face, only sadness and love. He said quietly, "My son, when heaven judges a person, they do not merely ask him, 'Did you learn?' They ask him, 'What happened to my children after they met you?'" The young man began troubling. The Chofetz Chaim pointed towards the frozen river once more, and he said, "Hillel saw a skull floating on the water, and he said, 'Because you drowned others, you were drowned.' Do you think that he spoke only about murder? There are people walking through life with drowned spirits, drowned confidence, drowned hope. Some were drowned by ridicule, some by shame, others by one sentence spoken some 20 years earlier." Well, the young man could no longer speak. Tears filled his eyes, as faces suddenly appeared in his memory. Classmates that he had mocked, employees that he had embarrassed, family members that he had cut down with sarcasm, disguised as honesty. And now, for the first time in his life, he realized that cleverness without kindness is cruelty wearing a mask. The Chofetz Chaim gently placed a hand on his shoulder, and he said, "Listen carefully. The same mouth that drowns can also rescue. The same tongue that destroys can also revive. If words can break souls, words then can rebuild souls." And then he smiled. And God Almighty waits eagerly for people who can rebuild. The two men stood silently before the frozen river for several moments. And finally the young man whispered, Rebbe, what should I do?" And the Chofetz Chaim answered him with one sentence, "Become the reason why other people believe in the goodness of God." Years later, that same young man became transformed completely. People said that his greatest gift was no longer his brilliance, but his gentleness. He became known for encouraging the broken, defending the embarrassed, and speaking to every person that he met with dignity and respect. And whenever someone asked him what changed his life, he would answer, "I once stood beside a frozen river, and I finally heard the sound of my own words." I hope you found this lecture interesting and informative. May God Almighty bless you with the strength and the wisdom to follow the advice of the sages. And next week, God willing, we will continue with the beginning of the 7th Mishnah in chapter 2 of Pirkei Avot. Again, let us all continue to pray for a swift and complete victorious end to the war in the Middle East with the total annihilation of Iran and all of her proxies. Let us celebrate the return of all of our hostages. May God Almighty cure the sick and injured, comfort all the mourners, and return home all the brave IDF soldiers led by Mashiach Tzidkeinu, and let it be quickly in our time. Again, let me thank you for attending, for listening. I hope these words penetrate deep within your heart, because we all need to hear them. We all need to be careful. We're called a medaber, one who speaks. Our greatest gift is the ability to speak, and it is also our greatest challenge. Words matter. Words matter. They resonate. We need to know that. Again, may God bless you all with only good, with happiness, with safety, with success, good health. And again, if you will, please, when you end the lecture, please push the like button, subscribe if you haven't, and please share with other people. It's important for people to hear these words. It's not religious, it's life. It's not something that whether a person puts on tefillin or not, or keeps Shabbos or eats kosher. It's about living life with other people, of showing dignity to other people, making people feel good. Just smile. It's amazing. Smile doesn't cost a penny, but what it can do is priceless. I'm going to end the lecture now, but just to know that I'm going to give a second lecture tonight. This Friday and Shabbos are Shavuos, a very important holiday. And what I'd like to do is just give some thoughts on the holiday. So if you can, please stay tuned.